Hey folks, tonight we're not diving into the mind of some philosopher. Nope, we're stepping onto a battlefield, but not the glamorous kind. No shiny jewels, slow-mo horse charges, or spotless armor here. Nope, tonight we're getting down and dirty with the real deal mud, confusion, panic, sweat, and steel. This is what a medieval battle actually looked like. And, spoiler alert, it's nothing like the movies. So before you get comfy, take a sec to hit like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely like what I'm doing here. Also, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fun to see who's joining us from around the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for some soothing white noise. Let's embark on tonight's journey together. You wake up to sounds like a foghorn and some dude yelling march like the world owes him money. No snooze button, no mattress, just cold, damp dirt and soul-crushing misery trying to sleep in your armor. You try to stretch, but instantly regret it. Your chainmail has fused to your skin like some medieval tattoo. Around you, dozens of soldiers are waking up looking equally miserable, their trench feet all matching. One guy is still passed out with a rain-soaked helmet stuck to his head. Another's hacking away at a bullet in his boot with a dagger. You're not sure if you should eat breakfast or just apologize to your organs first. Speaking of breakfast, it's what historians politely call disappointment, a rock-hard bread crust, probably from last Lent. You chew slowly, not because it's delicious, but because your jaw still aches from yesterday's mystery meat party, and something that used to be a vegetable at some point. You wash it down with warm beer because medieval water was basically a bacterial roulette. No time for grooming. Not that it matters. You haven't seen your own face in weeks, and honestly, that's a win. You slap a handful of swamp water on your cheek for that just cleaned feeling. Then you put on the same fear-fermented stinky armor. Then come the orders. Assemble, move out, the yelling from a horse rider who's obviously never walked a mile in his life. The army moves, men grumble, armor clinks, and some poor guy limps because he stepped on a sharp stone barefoot. Mud clings to your boots like it's trying to steal your soul. You haven't even met the enemy yet, and you're already exhausted, soaked, hungry, and vaguely regretting every life choice that led you here. And you want to know the worst part? This is one of the better mornings. Orders are shouted, step in time, and you do it. Not because you want to, but because if you don't, you get accused of desertion, which usually ends with something unpleasant getting chopped off. So you trudge forwards, every step heavy and miserable. The ground is less dirt and more wet. Mud, of course, but not just any mud. This mud sucks at your feet like it's trying to steal your soul, or at least your left foot. You stop to adjust a strap and immediately fall behind. Provoking death stares from the guy behind you, like he's thinking, I will eat you alive if you slow me down again. Turns out, armor wasn't made for hiking. It's stiff, tight, and rubs in places you didn't even know had skin. Your shoulders ache, your thighs burn, and the inside of your legs are basically forming a union against you with every clanking step. Basically, you're a walking iron sausage slowly baked in your own sweat. The air smells like cattle, cheap onions, and pure terror. Someone up front just let out a fart with the force of a man defeated by last night's turnip stew. You try breathing through your mouth and instantly regret that choice. You pass a dead hedgehog, a broken cart, and something that might be a toe. You're burning up, and the inside of your thighs are forming an alliance against you with every clunky step, basically. You're a walking iron sausage roasting slowly in your own sweat. The air smells like livestock, cheap onions, and pure terror. Someone ahead lets out a fart so fierce you'd think they lost a fight with last night's turnip stew. You try breathing through your mouth, instantly regretting that life choice. You pass a dead hedgehog, a broken cart, and something suspiciously like a toe. No one stops. Stopping is for people who enjoy being yelled at. The sergeant is still yelling. He never stops yelling. That's his whole personality now. Morale long gone. Some sing war songs to cope. Others mumble prayers. One guy in the back just screams into the wind. No one tells him to shut up. Honestly, it helps. At some point, you think. Maybe the enemy will just surrender before we get there. Then you remember they're probably thinking the same thing. So this is probably going to end in chaos, stabbing everywhere, and you trying to remember which spear goes where. After a few hours, a hill appears. Of course, every medieval battle happens on the dumbest hill possible. As you start climbing, someone slips and tumbles down. No one helps. They're fine now. Still, you keep marching. Finally, you reach the place where you definitely won't be sleeping tonight. The battle camp. Less like a cozy base, more like a poorly organized outbreak. If you're noble, sure, you get a tent. The rest get a slightly less cursed mud patch. You stake your claim by falling on the ground and calling it a bed. Your neighbor does the same. Congrats. You've just started a trench community. The stench hits your nose immediately. A horrific mix of wet wool, unwashed corpses, fermenting shoes, and whatever's rotting near the food cart. There's buzzing in the air. Not excitement, just flies. Thousands of them. Some even have names now. You've accepted it. Then comes the bathroom. And by bathroom, we mean a shallow, hastily dug hole in the ground filled with regret. Privacy, nope. Smell biblical. You try not to make eye contact during your visit. Everyone's dignity is long gone. They hand you a bowl of stew. It's gray. That's the only flavor. Gray. You ask what's in it, and the cook stares at you for 5 seconds like you just lost your mind before walking away. You eat it anyway because you're starving and hoping whatever meat's in there didn't have a name 2 hours ago. Some dudes sharpen weapons. Others play dice. Some pray loudly not out of devotion, but to make sure everyone knows they're praying, just in case God wants to amp up the drama. Then there are the sounds. Coughing, distant wails, a guy off-key singing about bread, and someone trying to play looting like it's a weapon. You hear a knight bark orders. He's clean. He smells like lavender. You instantly hate him. Night falls. You curl up in a damp cloak beside a guy snoring like he just swallowed a donkey. You try to sleep, but your brain's busy imagining all the ways you might die tomorrow, or tonight if that goat kicks your ribs again. Just as you start to drift off, a distant voice calls out, "Assemble at sunrise. Fantastic." Another bright morning awaits. Dawn breaks with the cold realization you're probably gonna die in a field. Maybe before lunch. You haven't even brushed your teeth if you even had any worth keeping. Trumpets sound. Men groan. You crawl out of your lice-infested wool cocoon to see your comrades pretending to be pumped. You line up because standing in formation somehow makes the impending doom feel a little more manageable. That's a lie, but it's a lie you can shuffle into with numb feet and questionable bowel control. Then he appears, the noble commander, a man in armor so shiny it almost glows. Those awkward seconds before you bail, you still eat it because you're starving, hoping whatever meat's in there isn't from that guy 2 hours ago. Some dudes are sharpening weapons, others are playing dice. Then there's the loud prayer crowd, not out of piety, but to make sure everyone sees they're praying, just in case God wants to add some dramatic flair. Those sounds, then other sounds, coughs, distant weeping, a guy off-key singing about bread, and someone trying to play looting like it's a weapon. You hear a knight barking orders. He's clean, smells like lavender. You hate him instantly. Night falls. You curl up in your damp cloak, lying next to a guy snoring like he just swallowed a donkey. You try to sleep, but your brain's busy imagining all the ways you could die tomorrow or tonight, especially if that goat kicks you in the ribs again. Just as you start to drift, a voice calls out from afar, "Assemble at sunrise." Fantastic. Another lovely morning awaits. The dawn breaks, along with the cold realization you'll die in a field, so probably soon, maybe before lunch. You haven't even brushed your teeth. Not that you have a toothbrush or any teeth worth keeping. Trumpets blare. Men groan. You crawl out of your cozy, louse-ridden wool cocoon to see your squad pretending to be pumped. You line up because standing in formation makes you feel like you've got a shred of control over your impending doom. It's a lie, but it's the lie you can hobble into with numb legs and questionable gut control. Then he appears, the noble commander, a guy in armor so shiny it practically glows. He's got the kind of energy only folks who've never been punched in the face possess. He looks over the troops like a disappointed parent who just found out you joined the losing team in a bar fight. He clears his throat. Everyone braces. It begins. Suspicious gut control. And then he showed up. The noble commander, a man in shining armor. So shiny he practically glowed. He had the kind of energy only someone who's never been punched in the face could have. He looked over the soldiers like a disappointed parent who just found out you joined the losing side in a bar fight. He cleared his throat. Everyone brace yourselves. Here we go. Brothers, today we fight for glory. He paused for dramatic effect. Someone nearby coughed up something still alive, because for our king, our land, our honor. The crowd murmured, mostly because near you coughs up something still alive. For our king, our land, our honor. The crowd murmurs, mostly because their stomachs hurt, not patriotism. Look at your brothers. Look at your sword. You glance sideways. The guy next to you is visibly shaking and wearing his helmet backwards. His sword is bent. The enemy fears us. Maybe they don't. Maybe they have their own people yelling the same thing in a different voice. If you die today, oh well. The fun part, You die a hero. You hold back the urge to raise your hand and ask, "Can I die later or maybe the baker?" Then comes the part about God. God is on your side. That's so comforting. Except you're pretty sure God's been busy punishing everyone equally this season. The speech ends with a sword pointed to the sky and a big yell forward. Nobody moves. A few blink. One guy sneezes. The yelling keeps going until finally someone shuffles forward and the rest reluctantly follow, not because they're convinced, mostly because standing still means the commander might pick you for a volunteer job, and you've heard what happened to the last poor volunteer, so the pep talk ends. Now you're ready to panic with purpose. Time to form ranks. A fancy phrase that conjures images of precision, discipline, and strategy. But what you actually see is a bunch of confused people vaguely staring in the same direction. Half of them are still struggling with their helmets. Some clutch weapons they picked up 5 minutes ago. One guy's holding a pitchfork. You're pretty sure he just wandered in by accident. Your sergeant, probably a pig farmer 3 years ago, starts yelling numbers. Nobody knows what they mean, but everyone nods like they do. "Frontline shield wall," he shouts. The second row steps up. You follow orders, even though the guy in front of you is holding his shield upside down and using it to scratch his back. To your left, a guy with a spear twice his height is accidentally poking people. On your right is a man humming a battle hymn. Maybe the green-sleeved guy with different lyrics or not. Just behind you, someone's gasping like they practice dramatic death moans. You suspect he's not even hurt, just ready. Cavalry has moved aside. Horses gallop on the ground spectacularly. The knights sit tall and shiny in armor, worth more than your whole village. They look impressive. Meanwhile, you're standing in borrowed shoes and chainmail that smells like someone died in it. Probably because someone did. Suddenly there's an order to move forward and tighten ranks. Easier said than done when every 2 people are stepping on each other's feet and mud threatens to swallow the little soldiers whole. Your feet slip. Someone elbows you. Your shield leans back, and you don't have the emotional energy to fix it. Then the drum sounds, a slow, ominous thud signaling everyone that it's about to start. The men begin whispering prayers. One guy starts, crying silently. You pretend not to notice, mostly because you're busy making peace with death. You take a deep breath, raise your weapon, and try not to pass out. There it is. You're ready. Yeah, as ready as any scared peasant line winding up, just as the formation starts looking somewhat reliable, meaning no one's actively wandering off. The sky betrays you. It begins with a sound, a faint, distant whistle, then becomes the whispering chorus of doom. Then the screams begin. Raise your shields, you scramble to obey, even though someone nearby is still trying to figure out which end of the shield goes up. Moments later, the sky darkens, not with black clouds, but hundreds of tiny death arrows shoot out from it starts with a sound, a distant, soft whistle that turns into the whispering roar of doom. Then the screams kick in, Raise your shields. You scramble to obey, even though someone nearby is still trying to figure out which end of their shield is supposed to go up. Moments later, the sky darkens, not with clouds, but with hundreds of tiny death arrows fired from the enemy's side with alarming enthusiasm. Then they rain down. Arrows pour like a storm, with all the mercy of an angry god having a really bad day. The guy 2 rows ahead drops instantly. An arrow sticks into his shoulder like a forgotten feather. Someone screams. Someone curses in Latin, or maybe he's just sneezing. Hard to tell in the chaos. This is the stuff movies don't show. Arrows don't glide gracefully like ballerinas on pointy toes. They clash, snap, stick, and sometimes bounce off armor before piercing things that really shouldn't be pierced, like feet, thighs, and whatever counts as emotional stability. You try to shrink behind your shields, which suddenly feels way too small and oddly homemade. An arrow clangs metal against it with a jingle, and you immediately decide this shield is now your best friend. You quietly name it Gerald. You promise Gerald that if you survive, you won't mock its wonky shape anymore. To your left, someone's cursing the archers. To your right, a guy is swearing mainly because he forgot to duck. Behind you, a man's yelling he's been hit, though you strongly suspect he's just trying to escape whatever hell's coming next. Then round 2 of the arrow storm hits. Any illusions of calm vanish. Veterans duck low and mutter prayers. Rookies sob like it's their last day on Earth. One guy just drops and plays dead. Behind you, some guy is yelling he's been shot, though you strongly suspect he's just trying to get out of what's coming next. Then the second volley hits. By now, any illusions of calm have completely vanished. The veterans duck low, muttering mantras. The rookies are bawling their eyes out. One guy just lies down and pretends to be dead. Honestly, not a bad plan. The sky clears. You're still breathing. Gerald did good, but now the real horror begins hand-to-hand combat. Time to sweat buckets, scream your lungs out, and maybe get stabbed. No countdown, no pounding drums, no dramatic charge like in the movies. One moment you're trembling in line. The next, chaos explodes. It starts with an assault. Your side advances, not out of brave hearts, but the reluctant shove of guys who know hesitation means getting trampled. Someone ahead of you shouts some inspirational nonsense, immediately trips, and gets trampled, so you don't stop to help. Not because you're cruel, but because you're pretty sure if you do, you'll join him. Then you start swinging for real. There's a collision. You crash into another guy, like 2 potato sacks filled with sharp objects. Forget fancy swordplay. This isn't a dance. This is a meat grinder. You swing your weapon, maybe a sword, maybe an axe, maybe just some kitchen tool with flair. You don't aim. You don't have time. You just flail. You hear metal clang against metal, wood splinters, grumbling men, and someone nearby keeps yelling like it's a war chant. The fight is painfully close, intimate. Now you really notice the enemy's smell sweat, fear, and onions. No personal space here, just chaos. Sometimes you stab down, hoping it's not your own foot. Your helmet's fogged up. You can't see, you can't breathe. Someone's shoulder slams into your ribs, and both of you stagger, gasping. There's blood on your glove. Maybe not yours, maybe blood. Who cares? A guy swings at your head. You duck on instinct. He hits someone else. You exchange a glance, half sorry, half meh. No time for blame, just to survive. You try to remember your training, but mostly it's just swing hard and don't die. So you swing, sometimes hitting, mostly missing. Sometimes someone falls. Sometimes they scream. Sometimes they go quiet right away. You try not to look. This isn't a movie. This is the worst bar fight on earth, with 500 angry men and 0 referees. And it's just getting started. If you thought medieval battles were some classy clash of swords and heroic horns, you're so wrong. It sounds like a cattle market crashing into a blacksmith's shop during an earthquake. The first thing you notice is the yelling. It's constant, not just from the wounded, though there's plenty of those, but from the living too. Men shout to pump themselves up. They shout because they're stabbed. They shout because someone stepped on their foot, or because they forgot which side they're on and are wildly swinging at anything, moving, even bushes. You hear the high-pitched screams of young guys who should have stayed in the bakery, the gravelly growls of big axe-wielding dudes, and the shrill, almost apologetic moans of a guy who just realized he's wearing the wrong team colors. Somewhere behind the lines, someone yells, "Hold the line," with all the hope of a man yelling at the tide to stop. No one listens. You can't even hear him. You're too busy dodging weapons and wondering if your left hand always clicks like that. Then the weapons take over. Sword clashing against shield, maces thudding with a sickening sound as they hit something soft. Usually a face. Arrows whistle past your ear with the exact sound of regret. Sometimes a spear pierces armor, and the screams that follow make your spine reconsider its commitment to standing upright, straight up. But the worst sound isn't the yelling, not even the dying moans, but the wet squelch. Yeah, wet. The crunch of someone stepping on what was once a person, the mix of blood and mud under your boots. The crackle when someone lands badly and can't get up. These are sounds you don't forget. They haunt your nightmares. You also hear jangling armor, men crying for their moms, horses neighing, the crunching of someone stepping on what used to be a person, the squish of blood and mud mixing under your boots, the crackle when someone lands badly and can't get back up. These aren't sounds you forget. They haunt your nightmares. You hear clanking armor, men crying out for their moms, horses neighing, which, by the way, is incredibly creepy. And somewhere, unbelievably, someone's trying to sing a terrible, off-key hymn amid all this. Your ears start ringing, not from injury, just overload. Your brain gives up and takes a break, yet the screaming keeps going. If you expected a slow-motion ending like in the movies, where you get a final monologue before collapsing, I'm sorry to disappoint, but that's not how it goes down. Most folks in medieval battles die invisibly, unheard, and from behind, usually by some guy who doesn't even know your name, sometimes even a friend. See, The battlefield isn't a polite arena. It's a sweaty, chaotic mess where a sneeze might save your life. One minute, you're swinging an axe like a pro. The next, you're wounded. Something stabs you in the back. Your knees betray you. You fall face first into the mud with the grace of a collapsing haystack. No one notices. No one has time. No last words. No holding hands. Just you, the dirt, and a gnawing suspicion this might have been avoided if you'd taken up monkhood. Then there are those knocked over by horses, not stabbed, not slashed, not trampled. Nothing says a humiliating death like becoming one with the ground under a panicked warrior named Buttercup. And don't forget friendly fire, not the explosive kind, but the kind where a poorly trained militia guy wildly swings a whip, hoping for a big arc and accidentally takes off your ear or head. Either way, you'll be remembered as the guy who stood way too close to Jeff. Some fall and get left behind, whether unconscious, wounded, or just faking it. They lie still as boots trudge over them. Some survive, some don't. It all depends on luck, mud, and whether the looter mistakes them for actual loot. Sometimes it's embarrassingly random. A foot slips on blood-soaked grass. Ankle snaps in a hole someone dug to pee. Or they get crushed under a panicked crowd, all trying to run the same way. In short, medieval death isn't glorious, it's clumsy, undignified, and almost always sudden. That's why when someone survives, they're not praised for bravery, just for your head. Either way, you'll be remembered as the guy who stood way too close to Jeff. Some folks fall and get left behind, unconscious, injured, or just playing dead, lying still while shoes shuffle over them. Some make it out alive, some don't. It all comes down to luck, mud, and whether the looters mistake you for actual loot. Sometimes it's embarrassingly random. A foot slips on bloody grass. An ankle snaps in a hole someone dug for a quick bathroom break. Or you get crushed under a panicked crowd all running the same way. Bottom line, medieval death was not glamorous. It was clumsy, undignified, and almost always sudden. That's why when someone survived, they weren't hailed for bravery, just dumb luck. Movies make it look epic, with horses charging and knights galloping in like fairy tale heroes. In reality, battlefield horses in the Middle Ages were anxious little troublemakers, not majestic war machines. When cavalry charged, you didn't hear trumpets, you just heard the chaos, a thunderous roar, not some poetic sound, but one that makes your ribs vibrate and convinces your intestines it's bathroom time. You look up, and there they are, giant war horses barreling toward you at speeds you wouldn't expect from a grass-eating herbivore. Knights looked impressive from afar, shiny armor, fluttering flags, and helmets so fancy they seemed to scream. I paid extra for this, but up close, all you hear are screams from the horses, from the knights, from you. Because here's the thing, horses don't care about your battle formation. They have zero respect for personal space, and they don't distinguish between enemy and anyone just trying not to get trampled. If you get in their way, you get crushed into something archaeologists will someday call a regrettable stain. One guy got completely flattened, vanished under hooves, never seen again. Another tried grabbing a knight's leg, slipped, and got kicked in the chest so hard he could legally be classified as a belle. Well, some knights went down. Surprisingly, it turns out slippery mud and full armor don't mix well. When they fell, it sounded like a pantry collapsing. With church bells getting punched, the noise was something else. The excitement of a guy who just realized he's still alive, but only inside a tent full of diseases. Another guy's yelling victory while clutching his mangled arm. Then they lie there like confused dung beetles, flailing and cursing as they try to get up before someone skewers them. And don't think the horses are immune to the chaos. One suddenly freaks out at a flag, barrels the wrong way, dragging its rider toward the latrine. Another just refuses to budge, sparking an awkward standoff between knight and horse that everyone politely ignores. For the infantry, there's only one rule: don't get trampled under a horse. That's a rule everyone learns fast, usually the hard way. Eventually, horses are bloodied, people scatter, and any formation that once existed becomes a tragic memory. The cavalry, well, they'll probably do it all again tomorrow. At some point during the battle, after the arrows, the shouting, and being elbowed by at least 3 allies, you fall, maybe pushed, tripped over a severed limb, or slipped on the world's nastiest mix of blood, guts, and spilled breakfast. Whatever the cause, you're down and falling in medieval battle. That's not part of the choreography. It's a game changer. Now you've got about 3 seconds to make a life or death decision. Get up and maybe die, or stay down and maybe die. Getting up is brave, noble, and stupidly dangerous, because standing upright on a battlefield is basically waving a flag that says, hey, stab me here. You could get skewered just for trying. Worse, your own side might trample you, treating you like part of the floor. On the flip side, lying still isn't exactly safe either. People fall on you, horses stomp nearby, looters poke corpses to check if they're dead or just badly faking it. And if someone catches you pretending they might fix that, the situation drags on. Plenty choose the deadly option, lie still, gasp, and pray no one steps on your spine. You listen to the chaos swirling around, steel clashing with steel, screaming, the unmistakable splatter of something meeting a miserable end nearby. A man falls next to you. No movement. You try not to look. Sometimes that actually works. You survive by being the toughest fighter left on the field. Eventually, the battle keeps going. Noise fades, and you're still breathing. Victory, or something like it. The catch: you have to stand up, coated in dirt, blood of unknown origin, and the subtle shame of surviving by playing dead. When you stand up, thinking you're not part of the new dead crowd, you look around, dizzy, hunched over, and smelling like a haunted boot. No cheers, no attention. You're just a corpse that won't lie still, and by medieval standards, that makes you lucky. The battle's over. You're not sure how. No dramatic banners raised. No villainous generals shouting retreat over blaring horns. Just chaos giving way to less shouting, fewer clangs, and more groans. That's how you know it's done. The sounds shift from aggressive to exhausted. You blink through the blood, hoping it's not yours. And sweat. The fields littered with bodies, weapons, and occasionally a boot somehow separated from its owner, lying on a rock, quiet to a worrying degree. Someone mutters, "We won," with all the excitement of a man realizing he's alive, but stuck in a tent full of disease. Another yells, victory while clutching an arm that's no longer fully attached. You nod in agreement because technically, yeah, you're standing, breathing, and mostly intact. That counts as winning. But the truth is, medieval victories weren't always loud. You nod along because technically, yeah, he's standing, breathing, and barely hurt. That's a win. But the truth is, medieval war victories weren't always loud. It just meant you weren't dead yet, meaning you had to drag your bruised, aching body back to camp, past fallen comrades and old enemies, all wearing the same expression. This is basically how it ended. No celebrations, no parties. You might get half a war ale and some bread, which was worth more than weapons, but less than actual food. A priest prayed over the dead. Some men scavenged for anything useful on the corpses. The stare was dead-eyed, and a spear still stuck in his arm. You try to offer help. He refuses. "Now it's mine," he mumbles. The wound gets bandaged. Some shops reopen after 5 minutes. Infection risk high. Amputation risk also high. One dude scores a nice pair of boots and declares that day a victory. Your commander, still squeaky clean, gives a speech about courage and honor. You can't hear a word. Your ears are still ringing, and your brain is busy focusing on more important stuff, like not collapsing. You think about the guys who didn't make it. Then you think about your foot, maybe it's broken. Then you think about stew and instantly regret it. But hey, you're alive, dirty, injured, maybe concussed, but alive. Medieval speak for huge success. You sit down on a rock, exhale, and whisper what every survivor of a medieval battle murmured never again. Then you'll get called back for another skirmish next week, after sheathing your sword, and the battlefield's groans become the background music. It's time for the least glamorous phase of battle cleanup. You might think that means burying the dead and tending to the wounded. Technically, yes. But really, it's a mix of sorting, looting, and a horrifying medieval craft project using body parts as materials. First up, the medics arrive, and by medics, I mean guys with knives, bad eyesight, and zero formal training. Their favorite phrase, "That's gotta come off. Bite on this stick." A skilled surgeon might use alcohol to clean your wound. The less skilled might just drink it themselves first. You sit there with a sword, slash on your thigh, vaguely hoping it won't kill you. The barber surgeon, yes, the guy who usually trims beards, takes a look and says, "Let's see." Then he pulls out a needle that's sterilized by waving it near a candle. You try your best not to scream. You fail spectacularly. Meanwhile, bodies are getting tossed into heaps. Some get covered with cloth, most don't. You recognize a face or two but don't linger. The smell is shifting to full-on rot. Flies swarm in, eager for the all-you-can-eat buffet, One lands on your open wound. You swat it away, then realize it's probably the cleanest thing you've encountered all day. Other soldiers are packing up gear, a polite way to say looting. They poke through corpses for swords, helmets, shoes, anything not nailed down or twitching. You don't judge. You do the same. You need new shoes. Gregor doesn't need his anymore. Sorry. Gregor. Some dig shallow graves. Others light prayer candles. One guy just sits silently, eyes blank, a spear still stuck in his arm. You try to offer help. He refuses. It's mine now, he mumbles. The wounds get bandaged. Some shops reopen after 5 minutes. There's a chance of infection, a chance of amputation. Death depends on your luck and whether the flies are paying attention. By nightfall, the battlefield is quiet. The living stagger back to camp, muddy, bloody, and increasingly convinced the worst is still ahead. And technically, they're right. You survived. Technically, you left the battlefield with all your limbs and enough brain power to recognize your shoes, whether they belong to you or someone else from this morning. Now it's time to rest. And by rest, we mean crash somewhere dry and try not to cry. Back at camp, everything smells worse. Death could depend on your luck and whether flies cared to pay attention. By night, the battlefield was quiet. The living staggered back to camp, muddy, bloody, and increasingly convinced the worst was yet to come. And technically, they were right. You survived. Technically. You left the battlefield with all your limbs and just enough brain power to recognize. Your shoes may be yours, maybe someone else's from this morning. Now it's rest time. And by rest, we mean collapsing somewhere dry and trying not to cry. Back at camp, everything smells worse. Somehow sweat, blood, bad stew, and cooked horse meat linger in the air like a curse no one dares name. You find your spot, a patch of ground less muddy than the rest, and lie down as gently as if you just dropped a sack of onions. Around you, wounded men moan, some shout, one sings terribly, another prays to at least 3 different gods for safety. A nearby soldier wipes his sword with his shirt, the air thick like a curse no one dared to name. You find your spot, a patch of ground less muddy than the rest, and lie down as gently as if you just dropped a sack of onions. Around you, wounded men groan, some scream, one sings terribly, another prays to at least 3 different gods just for safety. Nearby, a soldier wipes his sword blade with his shirt. He's still wearing it. The cook is ladling something that might be food. You edge closer and get a spoonful. Legally, it's not soup. Emotionally, it counts. It's got the texture of regret and the color of. He's still wearing it. The cook's ladling out something that might be food. You edge closer and get handed something in a bowl. Legally, it's not soup. Emotionally sure, it counts. It's got the consistency of regret and the color of. Don't ask. You eat it. Shame's long gone. It got lost somewhere between the 5th arrow and the scene where the guy got smacked dead by a confused warhorse. You try to sleep. No dice. You're too sore. And the dude sitting next to you starts snoring like a church organ crashing down a hill. You shift positions a dozen times and end up wetter than when you started. You stare at the stars and wonder what you did in a past life to deserve this one. Occasionally, some limping soul drags a sword out of the shadows and mutters something like, "Next time." Yeah, spoiler. There won't be a next time. There's always a next time. Your commander paces the camp and pretends to be worried. His armor's still shiny. He's not bleeding. You hate him a little more, but you're still alive. Your body's one big bruise. Your brain feels like it's been boiled in onion beer, but you made it. This is the dead time in medieval warfare. Tomorrow, the cleanup continues, or worse, a parade. Surviving a medieval battle doesn't bring peace. What you get is a seat by the fire, a warm alcoholic drink, and the right to start rewriting history before the bruises on your body finish forming. This is how it always ends, not with a fancy ceremony or a poet singing ballads about your heroism. Nope. The story ends with a bunch of dirty, PTSD-ridden men sitting on soggy logs, trying to one-up each other with increasingly dubious tales. You listen to a guy swear he personally took down 6 knights with just a frying pan. Another claims he caught an arrow mid-air and threw it back. Someone else says he faced off against a war elephant in France, where there are no elephants. You nod, you sip, you lie a little too. In your version, you didn't trip over a corpse and scream. You strategically repositioned the scene. You tried crawling into the bushes to avoid cavalry. It turned into a stealth move. You skip the moment, begging a servant to hold your hand through the arrow storm because everyone here is doing the same, turning injuries into legends. It's not about ego. It's survival. If you can laugh about it, maybe it won't scar you forever. If you tell the story well enough, it might drown out the real memories, the smell of burnt meat, the dying man's gaze, the sound of metal hitting bone. Meanwhile, someone's grilling a sketchy piece of meat and no one asks questions. Laughter rings out, dry and desperate. A guy plays a guitar missing 2 strings. The music's off, but no one cares. A woman, a camp follower, patches a sleeve and hums like the world outside the firelight doesn't exist. You stare into the flames and think you somehow survived this by luck, chance, some miracle. Soon enough, you'll be on the move again, joining another battle, another glorious clash. But for now, there's still warmth, still bread, still the brotherhood of men who know exactly how much of your story is BS. Because theirs is too, and at least for one night, that's enough. Centuries before the Great Wall became one continuous stretch across northern China, this landscape looked like a chaotic chessboard of kingdoms, each with its own ambitions and anxieties. This was the Warring States period, a non-stop conflict where 7 powerful nations fought for control of central China. These kingdoms were always at odds, with very little reason to cooperate. Instead, they built their own walls, local makeshift defenses made of rammed earth, stone, and wood. These early fortifications weren't part of some grand unification plan. They were desperate measures, like drawing a line in the sand and daring the neighbor to cross it. More than barriers, they It's a power move. This is mine. Try and take it. But they weren't just scared of rival kingdoms. Up north, beyond the farms and river valleys, lived the nomadic tribes. Among them was a new leader named Hang. His skilled horsemen moved like ghosts on terraces, striking fast and vanishing before anyone could fight back. These raids weren't just annoying. They were a real threat. Livestock stolen, villages burned, trade routes cut off. The scattered states had no choice but to try building walls to keep the wild out. These early border fences stretched for miles but were flimsy. Rushed jobs made from rammed earth or layers of brush and mud. Some had wooden stakes or rough stones for support, but hardly any were built to last. What they lacked in durability, they made up for with manpower. Tens of thousands of farmers, conscripted soldiers, and prisoners forced into backbreaking labor, often with no breaks and no say. These rough walls weren't well maintained, prone to collapse over time and bad weather. Still, they marked the start of the idea that China's northern border could be tamed not by chatting it out or fancy diplomacy, but by sheer willpower and building walls. No king could imagine the Great Wall as we know it today. The dream of one barrier stretching across all of China came later, with an emperor who craved not just power, but eternity carved in stone. So amid dust and blood, the foundation was laid not just for a wall, but for a legend. In 221 BC, after centuries of chaos, one man did what no one before him could unite all of China. His name was Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of the Qin dynasty. And he didn't just want to rule, he wanted to redefine the whole landscape. While others saw a divided land stitched together by war, he saw the birth of an empire. To protect it, he needed something huge. One of his first orders as emperor was to connect and extend the walls built during the Warring States period. Those separate, some rotted, some barely glorified trenches, would be combined into one massive defense network to keep out the Xiongnu nomads and other northern tribes. But this wasn't a quick fix. This was an empire-scale construction project. Qin's vision wasn't just about military defense. It was about power, unification, and control. The continuous wall wasn't just a civilization's border. It was his personal power line. To build it, he mobilized hundreds of thousands soldiers, farmers, prisoners, even scholars who opposed the regime. Many worked themselves to death in remote mountain passes or scorching deserts. The people called it the longest cemetery on earth. Talk about a grim nickname. But the real scale of the project was unlike anything the world had ever seen. The materials were basic and crude, rammed earth pressed in layers between wooden frames. Workers stomped it down or pounded it with logs. Where there was stone, raw muscle was used to haul it. Tools were primitive. The terrain was brutal. But Qin Shi Huang didn't stop. He wasn't just building a wall. He built roads, standardized weights and measures, and even unified writing. In his mind, roads, laws, walls all part of one grand plan to create order from chaos and leave behind an empire that lasts forever. The original Qin wall might not look like the iconic stone fortress we imagine today, but it was the foundation, the start of a border that would rise, fall, and rise again through dynasties. And then it would fall into Han hands. After Qin Shi Huang died and the Qin dynasty quickly collapsed, many of his radical reforms were reversed, but not the wall, the Han dynasty. In 206 BC, and later in 220 AD, after Qin recognized that eternal truth between wooden frames, workers stomp or beat down with logs where there are stones. They use brute force to drag rocks. Tools were primitive, terrain was brutal, but Emperor Qin Shi Huang kept going non-stop. He didn't just build a wall, he built roads, standardized weights and measures, and even unified writing. In his mind, all that stuff, the roads, the rules, the walls was part of a grand plan to whip chaos into order and build an empire that lasts forever. Maybe the original Qin wall didn't look like the iconic stone beast we imagine today, but it was the foundation, the starting line of a border that would rise, fall, and rise again through every dynasty, and then it would fall into the hands of the Han dynasty after Qin Shi Huang's death and the rapid collapse of the Qin dynasty. Many of his sweeping reforms were reversed, but the wall, that stubborn thing, stuck around, the Han dynasty. 206 BC by 220 AD, following Qin's fall, they recognized that eternal truth. China's northern border was never really safe, and instead of throwing in the towel, the Han emperors doubled down, expanding, reinforcing, and reshaping the Great Wall, especially under Emperor Wu. The wall wasn't just a military fence anymore. It became the backbone of imperial strategy. The Han launched campaigns with the wall as their shield and spear, huge campaigns to shove back the Xiongnu, those nomadic horse-riding nightmares terrorizing the north for generations. In doing so, they stretched the wall further than ever into areas that would later become vital trade and migration arteries for centuries. The Han didn't just patch up Qin's old wall, they fine-tuned it. Instead of just packing earth, they mixed in bricks, stones, and fancy fortifications. Where the terrain allowed, watchtowers popped up at intervals, letting soldiers spot raiders from afar and light signal fires. An early warning system that sent news of attacks hundreds of miles in just a few hours. The Great Wall wasn't just a military tool, it turned into a logistics network, garrisons, signal towers, and supply depots made the wall a fast military highway. Troops moved swiftly, supplies got passed on efficiently, and messages zipped through signals or runners at breakneck speed. The wall became more than a line. It turned into a living defense system. Life along the Han River wasn't easy, but it wasn't forgotten. The Empire stationed thousands of soldiers and settlers at distant forts, creating a frontier society where families, merchants, and outposts clung to imperial protection. Over time, these lonely stops grew into small communities, and in their shadows, cultures mixed. Han folks and nomadic tribes traded, mingled, and sometimes fought at this dusty crossroads. By Han Dynasty's end, the wall had morphed into something new, not just a defense line, but a symbol of imperial presence in the vast northern lands. Still, even mighty Han couldn't hold that front forever. Chaos, collapse, and eventually a new dynasty with a bold new wall-building style followed. When the Han fell in 220 AD, China slid back into political chaos and warlord madness. The once mighty centralized empire broke into rival kingdoms during the Three Kingdoms period, dragging out centuries of instability, and as emperors crumbled, so did the focus on the Great Wall. Large sections of the Han and Qin walls crumbled into dust. Neglect, erosion, and looting took a serious toll. Outposts were abandoned. Watchtowers collapsed. In many places, the wall was no longer a defense structure, but a buried memory, swallowed by sand and overgrown vines. Without a strong central government to maintain it, the Great Wall was just way too massive to keep intact. But the northern threat never disappeared. Nomadic powers like the Xiongnu, Rouran, and later the Khitan rose and spread through the steppes. Some of these groups even carved out their own kingdoms in China, blending cultures and redrawing borders. By then, the wall wasn't a hard frontier anymore. It was more like a relic of an old defense dream, a boundary that no longer matched the political reality. Yet, bits and pieces of the wall still got used by local rulers. Some lords and regional dynasties repurposed the ancient defenses as foundations for new fortresses. Others scavenged old walls for materials. Bricks and stones got recycled into houses, temples, or their own local walls. It was the slow decay of what once was a fallen empire's legacy. Meanwhile, in people's imaginations, the wall blurred. It stopped being an empire-wide project and became a legend and an old story. Chinese poets wrote about distant battlefields and border forts, painting the northern frontier as cold, harsh, a place where men went to die and were rarely remembered. Still, even in decline, the idea of the wall held power. It lived as a symbol of what China once had and what it might have again, the dream of unity, strength, and clarity amid chaos. And that dream would rise again when a new dynasty was born from the military conquest was driven by a fiery ambition rising from the ashes the Ming dynasty. But first, it would take centuries to get there. When the Ming took power in 1368, China had endured centuries of invasions, collapses, and foreign rule. The trauma from the Mongol-ruled Yuan dynasty was still fresh. Mongol armies had swept through the north, controlling China for nearly a century. When the Ming kicked them out, it wasn't just a political win, it was a cultural power move, and it came with an urgent priority: never again. Ming emperors saw building a rock-solid northern barrier, not as a symbol, but as pure, practical necessity. Unlike the earthen walls of Qin or the scattered outposts of Han, the Ming wall was going to be different: stone, its bricks, and firepower. Serious construction kicked off in the late 1400s and ramped up in the 1500s, especially under generals like Qi Jiguang, who saw the wall not just as defense against Mongol raids, but as a way to flex Ming control. This dynasty wanted permanence, And boy, did they show it? They built with quarried stone and fired bricks. Walls got reinforced, drainage systems installed, watchtowers spaced evenly, and signal fires set up to send smoke by day and flames by night. This is the Great Wall most folks imagine today. Massive, winding, iconic, it snakes over mountains, drapes across deserts, and clings to cliffs like armor. Some stretches are as wide as modern highways. Others rise as high as a 3-story building, all designed to stand the test of time. But the wall wasn't just a military project. Along its length, the Ming built garrison towns, supply depots, and housing for soldiers, creating a parallel society of troops, farmers, and officials living and working in the wall's shadow. The wall wasn't just a border between China and barbarians. It was a lifeline for the soldiers guarding it and the empire relying on it. Still, the Ming Wall wasn't invincible. The nomads adapted. Raiders found weak spots. Corruption ran rampant among the guards. And when the Manchus showed up, they didn't storm the wall. They were just let in. But before that collapse, the Ming pulled off the impossible. They turned legend into stone and made the Great Wall truly great. Behind the majestic walls and parapets, the Great Wall was also a place of grit, monotony, and survival for thousands of men stationed along its vast length during the Ming era. Life was anything but heroic. It was harsh, cold, and often forgotten by the very empire they swore to protect. Soldiers lived in fortified camps and garrison towns scattered along the wall. These weren't shiny, elite troops. They were farmers, criminals, and peasants forced into servicemen who traded freedom or futures for a bowl of rice, a pair of boots, and a rough bed behind stone walls. Some volunteered, hoping for pay or honor. Others were punished, exiled to the border, where brutal winters and boredom were the only companions. Every day started with the usual grind patrols, drills, wall repairs, hauling supplies. The wall always needed tending. Stones shifted, mortar cracked, watchtowers needed fixing. Soldiers patched what they could with frozen hands, battling sandstorms in the west or blizzards in the north. No days off, just shifts and the ever-present threat of a Mongol attack. Food was simple and often scarce: millet, beans, salted meat. Vegetables grew in whatever scraps of earth they could find. If a raiding party hit the supply convoy, it wasn't just an inconvenience. A bowl of rice, a pair of boots, and a shabby bed behind those stone walls. Some volunteered, hoping for pay or glory. Others were sent as punishment, exiled to the frontier where brutal winters and boredom hung like frost. Every day started with the usual drill patrols, drills, wall repairs, hauling supplies. The wall itself needed constant TLC. Stones shifted, mortar cracked, watchtowers needed fixing. Soldiers patched up what they could with numb hands, battling sandstorms from the west or blizzards from the north. No days off, only shifts and the ever-present threat of a Mongol attack. Food was simple and often scarce: millet, beans, salted meat. Vegetables grew in tiny patches of dirt. If a raiding party hit the supply convoy, it wasn't just an inconvenience. It could mean starvation, disease was rampant, morale tanked, desertion happens, even with executions on the table. But life wasn't always bleak. Families often accompanied soldiers, forming small, isolated communities along the wall. Kids were born in its shadow. Merchants moved between garrisons, trading wine, fabric, and gossip. Some writings even hint at cultural mingling between nomads and settled Han through trade, marriage, or shaky peace. Then there were the lighthouse keepers, stationed at lonely watchtowers, through trade, marriages, or shaky peace deals. Then there were the lighthouse keepers, posted at lonely watchtowers, far from any garrison. Their job keep an eye on the horizon, smoke by day, fire by night. That was the signal. Fast, simple, and terrifying. These guys lived solo or in pairs, surrounded only by silence and sky. Living on the Great Wall was like existing between two worlds, empire and wilderness. Myth and reality. These invisible lives were what kept the wall standing. Not emperors, not generals, just ordinary folks with calloused hands and cold feet. But no matter how hard they tried, the wall couldn't hold up forever, for centuries. The Great Wall was China's ultimate flex, rock tough against shifting sands, empire tough against the unknown. But the wall, no matter how tall or thick, was only as strong as the people guarding it. And by the 1600s, that strength broke not from outside attacks, but from within. By the end of the Ming Dynasty, corruption had poisoned the whole imperial system. Soldiers' pay was late or stolen. Supplies vanished before reaching. The garrisons, the once disciplined troops guarding the wall, were now underpaid, starving, and overworked. Morale tanked. Many garrisons turned to smuggling and local trade just to survive, often teaming up with the very nomads they were supposed to keep out. In this mess, the Ming faced their biggest threat ever, the Manchus, a rising force from the northeast. Unlike previous nomads, the Manchus were organized, politically savvy, and dead set on ruling like any Chinese dynasty before them. They didn't need to storm the wall with fire and fury. All they needed was an open gate. That gate was built in 1644 when a Ming general named Wu Sangui made a history-changing call, faced with a peasant rebellion that had taken Beijing and outnumbered his forces. Wu opened the Shanhai Pass, the wall's key entry point, to let in the Manchu army. He hoped they'd help crush the rebellion. Instead, they took the capital and founded the Qing dynasty, just like that. The whole point of the Great Wall came crashing down. It wasn't conquered, it was ignored, betrayed by the very people it was meant to protect. The wall couldn't fight. Shifting loyalties, desperation, or political convenience. Under the Qing, the Great Wall lost its strategic importance. The empire pushed north, beyond the barrier that once marked the edge of civilization. The wall was no longer a border. It became a relic, a memory of another world. And so the Great Wall, a project, centuries in the making, turned obsolete in a single human slip-up. No siege, No breach, just keys falling into the wrong hands. But legends rarely die that quietly. After the Manchus took power and the Qing expanded China's borders far beyond the Great Wall, the old fortifications began to fade. No battles, just whispers. It was no longer a military priority. Trade routes bypassed it. New forts popped up deeper in the frontier. The Great Wall, once the colossal symbol of imperial will, became meaningless, without a purpose. Maintenance stopped, garrisons withdrew, watchtowers were left to crumble, locals scavenged bricks for houses, wells, and pigsties. In some spots, entire sections were dismantled stone by stone, not out of spite, but practicality. Why quarry new materials when the old wall was just sitting there in the desert? Sand slowly swallowed parts of it. On the mountains, roots pried rocks apart. Rain washed away the mortar. Digging deeper into the borderlands, the Great Wall, that colossal symbol of imperial grit, had become meaningless, without purpose. Maintenance stopped, garrisons pulled back, watchtowers crumbled, locals scavenged bricks for houses, wells, and pigsties. In some spots, whole stretches were dismantled stone by stone, not out of malice but practicality. Why quarry new materials when the old wall was just lying there in deserts? Sand slowly swallowed parts of it. On mountains, roots cracked stones apart. Rain washed away mortar. Centuries of storms, earthquakes, and time turned those mighty fortresses into tilted ridges and forgotten dirt mounds assault the horizon. Tourists and poets still marveled at its grandeur, but few wanted to actually visit. For most of the Qing dynasty, the wall was a relic of a bygone era, respected but rarely maintained. It wasn't until the 19th and early 20th centuries, when China wrestled with foreign invasions, civil war, and that the wall started creeping back into the national consciousness. Foreigners especially, European explorers and scholars showed up wide-eyed and notebook-ready. They romanticized it. They were amazed by it. Some even got it wrong, thinking the whole thing was built by one emperor, or maybe that you could see it from the moon. By the time the People's Republic of China was founded in 1949, the wall was no longer just stone and mortar. It became a symbol of identity, resilience, and Chinese craftsmanship. Mao Zedong famously said, "He who has not climbed the Great Wall is not a true man," turning it from a ruin into a patriotic pilgrimage. By the late 20th century, restoration projects kicked off, especially near Beijing. Tourists flocked to spots like Badaling, where the wall was rebuilt to its Ming Dynasty glory. Meanwhile, other parts, wild, broken, and raw, stood their ground, but slowly gave in to nature's takeover, from a forgotten ruin to a global icon. The Great Wall's journey has been nothing short of bizarre. No longer a defensive barrier, it's become a bridge to the past, a reminder of what humans can build when driven by fear, ambition, and dreams that stretch across centuries. China's Great Wall is one of the most famous architectural feats on Earth. But here's the kicker. Most of what people know about it is pure myth and hype. Contrary to popular belief, it's not one single wall, but a network of fortifications built by different dynasties over 2,000 years, winding through mountains, deserts, and plains. It's not one neat, straight line, and no, you can't see it from the moon, but the truth is way cooler. The wall isn't about bricks and mortar, it's about memory and metaphor. It stands for a civilization's long struggle to define itself, not just against outside forces, but also internal chaos. The story is about emperors obsessed with order, peasants forced into grueling labor, and generals whose legacies weren't measured in battles won but in walls built. It's the product of ambitions so huge they left scars visible from the sky. Throughout Chinese history, the wall meant different things to different people, to emperors. It symbolized control. To soldiers, it was a prison of duty. To poets, it was solitude, echoing with wind and the weight of separation. And to modern China, it's a cultural icon, a reminder of endurance, strength, and national pride. Millions of visitors walk its restored paths and pose by ancient watchtowers. They're drawn not just by the views, but by the legend, the idea that human hands created something so massive, so defiant, it outlasted empires, dynasties, and even time itself. And in many ways, that's exactly right. But most of the wall is still crumbling. Over 30% is gone, worn away, or destroyed. Preservation today is a race against weather, development, and plain forgetfulness. The challenge now isn't building the wall, it's remembering and protecting what's left, preserving a past that stretches across continents and centuries. Ultimately, the Great Wall was never really meant to stop enemies. It was about drawing the line between civilization and wilderness, empire and uncertainty, the known and the terrifying. And in doing so, it became something bigger than defense. It became legend. Every stone, every story, the wall still stands tall, not just on the hills of northern China, but in the world's imagination. Back in 1860s, America was teetering on the edge of greatness and meltdown, with Civil War looming and the gold rush raging in California. One thing was crystal clear: the U.S. was growing faster than its communication systems could handle. The East Coast buzzed with telegraph lines and railroads, but the West Coast felt like a whole other continent, sending mail from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento. California could take 3 to 4 weeks on a good day. Of course, that's assuming your stagecoach isn't slowed down by snow, bandits, or the sudden collapse of some rickety old bridge. And in a country obsessed with instant results, waiting a whole month to find out if your gold shipment arrived, or if Lincoln got the nomination, was just unacceptable. The government tried alternative steamships around Cape Horn or through the Panama Isthmus, both risky, expensive, and painfully slow. But the West demanded real-time updates, not news that's ancient by the time it arrives. What this country needed was speed, and preferably without a 6-month grand tour of South America. Enter the Pony Express, a bold, reckless, and frankly crazy idea. The concept was simple: saddle up a team of young, lightweight riders to race day and night across nearly 2,000 miles of rough terrain. Relay stations were spaced 10 to 15 miles apart. Horses swapped out within minutes, and no one stopped for anything. Rain, snow, whatever tough luck. Mail could now travel from Missouri to California in under 10 days. Sounds nuts. Right. Well, so did building a transcontinental railroad, and look how that turned out. This wasn't just mail delivery. It was a statement that the American frontier could be conquered with grit, guts, and a heck of a lot of horse saddles. It was about turning a chaotic, sprawling land into something that felt a little more connected. At the heart of this madness was a ragtag team of entrepreneurs, teenage riders, and sleep-deprived station managers about to make history on horseback. But no matter how fast they rode, Pony Express soon realized it was racing against something it couldn't beat: the speed of light. The masterminds behind Pony Express weren't wild cowboys or government officials. Nope. They were ruthless, ambitious, and maybe a little desperate businessmen. William H. Russell, Alexander Majors, and William B. Waddell were deep in the freight business. They hauled supplies to army posts across the West, moving everything from flour barrels to cannons through Native American territory and barren plains. But contracts were drying up, and the economy was shaky. So, like all capitalists cornered by crisis, they rolled the dice. Their new plan: launch the fastest mail service in American history and snag a juicy government contract to turn a profit. They called it the Central Overland California and Pikes Peak Express Company. Honestly, try saying that 5 times fast. The press and public quickly gave it a catchier name: Pony Express. This wasn't just logistics. It was a full-throttle sprint through hell. The route stretched nearly 2,000 miles from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California, slicing through America's brutal wilderness. Rocky Mountain passes that could swallow whole stagecoaches, and Nevada deserts where horses could drop dead in hours. Still, Russell and Company believed they could pull it off. They built over 150 relay stations, hired around 80 riders, and bought 400 of the fastest, strongest horses money could buy. Their first big win, delivering Lincoln's inaugural address to California in record time. Sure, a PR stunt, but also a challenge to the telegraph and stagecoach, the 19th century's media giants. The first ride kicked off on April 3rd, 1860. Crowds gathered in St. Joseph to watch the first rider sprint out of town with a satchel of mail dangling from his saddle. Cheers erupted. A legend was born behind the scenes. Though the company was bleeding money, stations needed staff, horses needed feeding, riders needed paying, and gear constantly needed replacing. But no one cared about the books. All eyes were glued to the trail. Would this wild experiment actually work? What followed was not just fast. Rocky Mountain passes that could swallow entire wagon trains, and Nevada deserts where horses could drop dead in hours. Still, Russell and his crew believed they could pull it off. They built over 150 relay stations, hired about 80 riders, and bought 400 of the fastest, toughest horses money could buy. Their first big win delivering. Lincoln's inaugural address to California in record time. The plan was a PR stunt. Sure, but also a challenge to the telegraph and stagecoach, the media giants of the 19th century. They launched the first run on April 3rd, 1860. A crowd gathered in St. Joseph to watch the first rider burst out of town with a mailbag slung over his saddle. Cheers erupted. A legend was born behind the scenes. The company was losing money. Stations needed caretakers. Horses had to be fed, riders paid, and gear constantly replaced. But nobody cared about the books. All eyes were glued to the trail. Would this bold experiment actually work? What happened next was not just fast, but a wild mix of guts, chaos, and daring improvisation. Riders raced through blizzards, dodged ambushes, and sometimes crossed rivers still frozen solid. They weren't just carrying mail, they were carrying the promise of a united country, and for one brief, glorious moment. It worked. Pony Express had one. Main rule for riders, they had to be young, really young, ideally orphans, that way. If they died on the main gig for these horse riders, they had to be young, like really young. Orphans were the top pick, because if they died on the job, typical riders were between 14 and 20 years old, weighing no more than 125 pounds. The lighter the kid, the faster the horse could run. Ads usually called for skinny, scrawny boys under 18. Orphans preferred part job offer, part daredevil challenge, and the guys who answered the call special breed reckless, stubborn, and addicted to speed. Among the most famous was William Buffalo Bill Cody, who later became a Wild West legend, though it's still debated how many rides he actually did for the Express. The image of a teen named Cody charging through hostile territory, armed only with a pistol and a mailbag, helped build the myth. Then there was Pony Bob Haslam, who pulled off one of the longest and most dangerous rides in Express history, 120 miles through Paiute territory. Arrows still stuck in his back. These guys weren't just delivery dudes. They were adrenaline junkies, riding full throttle through rain, snow, and sandstorms, often day and night, with barely a break. They carried a moolah, a special saddlebag designed to be tossed between horses, holding around 20 letters, sealed tight in oilskin to keep the weather out. Every second counted. Riders switched horses every 10 to 15 miles, stopping just long enough to swap saddles on the Machilla and take a quick sip of water. Each cyclist covered 75 to 100 miles per leg, and then stopped at a station to eat, rest, and keep going. Danger lurked everywhere: bandits, wild animals, river crossings, and attacks from hostile tribes protecting their land. The Express didn't carry war weapons, but every rider had a pistol, a knife, and a whole lot of guts. They rode solo through the night, usually accompanied only by horse hooves and the wind, despite the risks. Pony Express almost always delivered. Letters pretty much always arrived on time, and in just 18 short months. These reckless teens became legends, living symbols of American grit, while the riders got the glory. The real heroes were the relay stations, about 157 of them, that kept Pony Express running. Without them, no heroic rides, no 10-day records, and definitely no letters reaching Sacramento intact. These stations were quiet heroes, spaced 10 to 15 miles apart across deserts, plains, and mountain passes, little islands of civilization in the wild ocean. There were two main types: relay stations and home stations. Relay stations were simple setups where riders swapped out tired horses for fresh ones. This swap was basically a pit stop, usually done in under 2 minutes. Imagine a kid not old enough to vote, racing full speed, tossing his mochila bag onto a waiting saddle, then speeding off in a cloud of dust. Stations were 75 to 100 miles apart and served as rest stops for riders. Here, young guys could eat, sleep, and try to recover before hitting the trail again. These places were usually run by a station keeper and their family, living in isolated cabins or small houses with just a fireplace and a strong sense of duty. The mail depended on them. One lost horse, a closed gate, or a sleepy guard could cause hours of delay, and that was a no-go. Life at these stations wasn't glamorous. Supplies were scarce. Desert or remote plain stations had to fend off raids, survive brutal winters, and deal with wildlife. At a station, well, at least they kept the Pony Express running. Without them, no heroic sprints, no 10-day records, and definitely no letters arriving in Sacramento unscathed. These stations were the unsung heroes, scattered every 10 to 15 miles across deserts, plains, and mountain passes like tiny islands of civilization in a vast ocean of wilderness. There were two main types: relay stations and home stations. Relay stations were simple setups, just basic structures where riders swapped their tired horses for fresh ones. This horse swap was basically a pit stop, usually done in under 2 minutes. Picture a kid too young to vote, galloping full throttle, tossing his mochila hat onto a waiting saddle, then disappearing into a cloud of dust. Home stations were about 75 to 100 miles apart and acted as rest stops for the riders. Here, these young bucks could eat, sleep, and try to recover before hitting the trail again. These spots were usually run by a station keeper and their family, living in isolated cabins or tiny homes with just a fireplace and a heavy dose of responsibility. Delivering the mail depended on them. Lose a horse, close a gate, or have a sleepy caretaker, and you're looking at hours of delay. Totally unacceptable. Life at these stations wasn't glamorous. Supplies were scarce. Stations in high desert or deep plains had to fend off raids, survive brutal winters, and deal with wild animals, from rattlesnakes to wolves. The station keepers often lived with a rifle within arm's reach and one eye open while sleeping. Yet somehow, this system mostly worked. Horses were strategically placed. Riders had to stick to a strict schedule. Each station was like a heartbeat in the Pony Express's big circulatory system. One slow beat and the whole body felt it. But when the writing was on the wall, it was like trying to outrun lightning. You could be the fastest rider alive, but you couldn't beat the raw power of messages that used to take weeks suddenly got knocked down to 9 or 10 days. Letters sent from New York could pass through dozens of hands, hundreds of hooves, cross a continent full of dangers. and still arrive ahead of schedule. The system was bold, fragile, and ridiculously efficient, but also crazy expensive. And now it was time to pay the piper. The Pony Express train ran fast. So fast it was unbelievable for its time. But speed comes at a cost, and not just risk, sweat, or the occasional horse dropping dead halfway through. The price tag was huge, painfully expensive, and totally unsustainable right from the start. Pony Express was bleeding money. Running across 1,600 kilometers of brutal terrain demanded massive resources. Just building the infrastructure, the stations, stables, grazing fields, and supply depots cost the founders about $200,000, which was a fortune in 1860. Then came the horses, hundreds of them, bred for speed and stamina, not longevity, and of course, the riders and station staff were paid peanuts. At first, each letter cost $5 for half an ounce, adjusted for inflation. That's roughly $170 today just to send a short note. Even when prices dropped to $1, it was still way out of reach for most Americans. The service was mostly used by reporters, the government, or businesses desperate to get a message through. Think Wall Street, not Grandma's birthday card, despite all its boldness and glory. Pony Express never made a dime in profit. The founders, Russell, Major, and Waddell bet on landing a profitable government mail contract. Spoiler alert, that never happened. The U.S. Postal Service wasn't keen on funding what many saw as a dangerous stunt. And the political mess before the Civil War didn't help either. By the end of 1860, the financial pressure was unbearable. Horses needed feeding, stations needed upkeep, riders had to be replaced, and all that came out of their own pockets. Worse, the public's romantic image of the Pony Express masked the brutal reality. This was a logistical nightmare racing against the clock. Then came the final punch. In October 1861, the transcontinental telegraph was completed. Suddenly, a message could be sent anywhere in seconds. No horses, no riders, no risks, just dots and dashes on a wire. That was the future, cold, efficient, and unstoppable. 2 days after the telegraph line opened, the Pony Express shut down. 18 months. That's all it lasted. But in that short time, it became a legend, not because it made money, but because it proved something bolder, that America could overcome its obstacles. On October 24th, 1861, a small but thunderous revolution swept across the country. The transcontinental telegraph line was finally complete, linking East Coast to West Coast for the first time in history by wire. In that moment, the very purpose Pony Express was built for fast cross-country communication became obsolete. Messages that used to take 10 days on horseback could now be sent in minutes. No romance, no wild horses or heroic riders racing through blizzards, just trained telegraph operators tapping Morse code on buzzing machines. But it worked, and it worked better than anyone expected. For Pony Express, it was like trying to outrun lightning. You could be the fastest rider alive, but you can't beat the raw power of electricity flowing through copper wire, 2 days after that telegraph line was up. Pony Express, electricity zipping through a copper wire. 2 days after that telegraph line was finished. The Pony Express officially shut down. No dramatic finale, no farewell ride, just silence. Ironically, that silence stuck around after the last Morse code beep faded each night for Russell, Major, and Waddell. It was a financial disaster. They bet everything on this business, dreaming of snagging a government contract. But the government, now obsessed with the telegraph, saw horseback mail delivery as pretty useless. The company folded, assets sold off. The company got shut down, assets sold off, dismantled, and the founders either went bankrupt or faded into obscurity. Yet, despite all its speed and progress, the telegraph just didn't hit the emotional feels. You can't really draw heroics with dots and dashes. No one's writing love songs about clicking on dots and dashes. Meanwhile, Pony Express, despite failing, had the better story. The riders became legends. Their feats were told in dime novels, stage plays, and eventually Western movies. Even Buffalo Bill, who actually had ties to the Express, probably exaggerated a bit, built his entire career on that legend, touring the world as the symbol of Wild West bravery. So while the telegraph won the race, Pony Express won the legend contest. It was the last gasp of old world adventure before America truly got connected, mechanized, and modern. Though Pony Express lasted only 18 months, its legend outlived it by more than a century. Right after the service ended, writers, journalists, and hosts began turning it into a myth, a romantic tale of danger, speed, and gritty American spirit. The truth was impressive, but truth alone just wasn't enough. People wanted something bigger than life, so the story grew. They said the riders could outrun native raiders, leap over canyons, and survive days without water. Historians raised eyebrows. Readers gobbled up penny novels by the boxcar. Nobody milked this better than Buffalo Bill Cody. Though it's unclear exactly how long Cody actually worked for Pony Express. If he did, he saw the opportunity. On his Wild West show, Cody reenacted thrilling Pony Express rides to cheering crowds in Europe and across the U.S. Kids grew up picturing the lone rider bravely charging the wilderness, mail pouch strapped on. By the late 19th century, Pony Express wasn't just a failed mail service. It had become a national symbol of frontier bravery, manifest destiny, and the time when a teenage rider on a Mustang could carry the whole nation's communications on his shoulders. Towns along the original route started celebrating stations. Statues were built, plaques were placed in St. Joseph in Missouri and Sacramento, California. Historic markers proudly declared this is where Pony Express began. School kids were taught about the riders like founding fathers on horseback, and of course, Hollywood jumped on board fast. Silent films, TV shows, and cowboy flicks gave us exaggerated but charming versions of the Express, usually skipping the brutality, short lifespan, and financial disaster of the real deal. Still, the romantic allure stuck around, maybe because Pony Express tapped into something timeless, The idea that sheer grit and stubborn willpower can overcome seemingly impossible odds. Youth and courage still matter before modern tech. There was still room for human spirit to shine, even if just briefly. So even as telegraph wires buzzed overhead, then telephone lines and satellites, the image of a young rider speeding past, planes never faded from the American imagination. Pony Express wasn't just mail delivery, it was a legend, a blueprint, a sharp silhouette of what Americans want to believe about themselves in a country united by ambition and risk. It became the perfect story, bold, such brief, tragic, and fast. Essentially, Pony Express painted a uniquely American fantasy that one person, armed with enough courage and will, fueled by ambition and risk, it became the perfect story, bold, brief, tragic, and fast at its core. The Pony Express captured a uniquely American fantasy that one brave soul with guts and grit could carry the weight of a vast nation on his back. A teenage rider braving storms and arrows wasn't just about frontier resilience. It was youth flipping the bird at the impossible. It wasn't about efficiency, but heart. As the 20th century dawned and America industrialized, the cowboys' missionary zeal turned into a kind of nostalgic fuel. Railroads stretched across continents, and telegraphs connected cities in milliseconds. But those machines lacked soul. Pony Express was the last hurrah of human, urgent, heroic communication. It was the final romantic moment before wires and gears replaced muscles and sweat. Politically, the Pony Express story was just as convenient. It painted westward expansion as noble and exciting, instead of chaotic, violent, or exploitative. Textbooks taught it as a victory of courage, not a tale of risky investments or clashes with Native Americans. In this way, Pony Express turned the messy parts of America's expansion into a feel-good story. A teenager galloping across the desert is way easier to cheer for than a land dispute or a bankrupt shipping company. But that doesn't lessen its impact. It proved the West could be connected, that distance could be conquered, and even though the Express flopped financially, it paved the way literally and figuratively for later infrastructure telegraphs, railroads, transcontinental highways. In a way, Pony Express was America's awkward teenage phase. Bold ideas, clumsy execution, high ideals, and a few broken bones along the way. It was a brief miracle that led to something bigger. And even now, when modern communication happens with just a tap, there's still something stirring about a lone rider galloping into the unknown, because somewhere, deep in the dust, there's a reminder that progress came on 4 legs, and courage. On October 26th, 1861, just 2 days after the Transcontinental Telegraph went live, the last Pony Express rider galloped into Sacramento. No fireworks, no farewell parade, just a quiet end to one of the boldest communication experiments in U.S. history. That's how it ended. But that final ride wasn't a failure. In fact, it was a victory lap. Pony Express had done its job. It proved that a huge, wild country like the U.S. could be connected fast, reliably, and with sheer human grit, even though it was replaced by blinking telegraph signals. Pony Express set a standard. Urgency, bravery, and boldness still mattered in a world full of wires and machines. In the decades that followed, Pony Express nearly became legend. Statues of riders galloping were erected in town squares. Reenactments happened every July. Stamps commemorated its short, breathless run, and historians, sometimes amused, sometimes amazed, keep revisiting those 18 months that changed how America saw itself. It's easy to forget how fragile it all was. Mail packed in light pouches could be handed off between riders in seconds. Horses were trained to race full speed over cliffs, rivers, and mountains. Riders were barely old enough to grow a beard. There were ambushes, stampedes, and blizzards. And yet, despite all that, most riders arrived on time. Pony Express also left something more subtle, a template for how Americans see risk and reward. The founders of Silicon Valley and Wall Street gamblers alike talk about the Pony Express energy bold moves made fast despite all odds. It's still a metaphor for trying something crazy just because it might work, even when it probably won't. Today, when you send a message across the globe in a second, it's hard to get what 10 days on horseback means. But that's the point. People don't remember Pony Express because it lasted long. They remember it because it tried. For a brief moment, a group of kids on horses outran the world. And even though they were eventually replaced by telegraph, telephone, and an internet, they pulled off what few projects ever do. They made history, then they became legend, and beyond speed. That's what makes Pony Express unforgettable. So yeah, hard to forget. Before the violin snagged its spot in the hearts of concertmasters and solo artists, before it filled opera houses and sonatas with all that emotional drama, it had lived many lives under different names. Its story didn't kick off in Italy, but way earlier, out on the vast, windy steppes of Central Asia. Centuries ago, folks there were stringing horsehair onto simple wooden bows to play instruments like the morin-kur and rebab. Those primitive bowed instruments were the nomads' jam, producing low nasal sounds that mimicked human voices or the animals they lived alongside. This was revolutionary, using friction instead of plucking or striking to hold a note. It was the birth of an expressive technique that would ripple through cultures. As trade routes grew, these instruments traveled west along the Silk Road, through Persia, into the Arab world, and eventually South Europe. The rebab, in particular, made its way to Moorish Spain in the 8th and 9th centuries, where it blended with local traditions. Meanwhile, the Byzantine Empire was cooking up the lira, a different bowed instrument that later influenced Eastern European designs. Every culture added its own twist, different tunings, new shapes, extra strings. These instruments didn't evolve in a straight line. They branched out like a family tree. In medieval Europe, the rebab paved the way for the vielle and fiddle boxy instruments held against the chest or tucked under the chin. These were the instruments of wandering minstrels and church musicians, playing simple tunes in taverns, streets, and court halls. Their sound was rough but cozy, basic but clever. The bow had arrived, bringing with it a fresh way of thinking about music, not just a string of short notes, but a continuous, flowing voice. But those first violins were still pretty crude compared to what came later. Their shapes varied wildly. Tuning was all over the place. No standard form, no fancy fingerboards, no design for agility. Yet in their shaky sounds and handmade quirks, the violin's soul started to hum. The idea was there, the craving for something quicker, more emotional, more human, just waiting for the right person at the right place to show up. When the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance, Europe was flooded with new ideas about art, science, and music. Between churches and courts, a quiet revolution was brewing. The rough violins and viols of previous centuries got a makeover not just in looks, but in purpose. These instruments weren't just for dancing or making pretty sounds anymore. They were becoming tools for expression. By the 15th century, bowed string instruments were all the rage across Western Europe. You'd hear them in pubs, weddings, noble chambers, and theaters, but no two places sounded quite the same. Violas typically had 5 strings, and their shapes varied a lot depending on the maker. The lira da braccio, a favorite in Italy, had a wide body and flat bridge perfect for chords and beloved by Renaissance poets and humanists who liked setting their verses to music. But despite growing popularity, these instruments still had their limits. Their sound lacked punch. Their tuning systems were unreliable. Their designs were clunky compared to the skill level of musicians. Composers and players started demanding more flexibility, wider range, clearer tone, quicker response, something that could sing like a voice, but also whistle like a flute. Meanwhile, a quiet revolution was happening in instrument making. Craftsmen across Italy and Germany were experimenting with bent wood, new varnishes, and finer carving tools. They weren't just shaping wood, they were shaping resonance. Luthiers began to realize that the shape and thickness of the wood seriously affected the sound. Thinner tops vibrated better, rounded backs stuck out more, curved bridges let players bow individual strings. An unreliable system of tuning. Designs were clunky compared to real skill. Musicians and composers started demanding more flexibility, wider range, clearer tone, faster response, something that could sing like a voice, but sound like a flute. Meanwhile, a quiet revolution was happening in instrument making. Craftsmen across Italy and Germany experimented with curved wood, new varnishes, and more precise carving tools. They weren't just shaping wood, but also resonance. Louis began to realize that the shape and thickness of the wood hugely affected the sound it produced. Thinner tops vibrated better, rounded backs stuck out more, curved bridges let players strike individual strings. Musical tastes were changing too. Composers started writing more complicated parts for string instruments. The demand wasn't just rhythm or harmony anymore. It was melody, something lyrical and solo-worthy. The stage was set for a new kind of instrument, small, flexible, and full of expression. Small, flexible, and expressive. Europe had all the ingredients, the lineage, stringed instruments, dating back centuries, Renaissance artistic energy, and a fresh batch of master craftsmen ready to build the future. The only thing missing was someone bold enough to reinvent the whole thing from scratch. And in the little town of Cremona, Italy, someone was about to pick up the chisel. Nestled in the fertile plains of northern Italy, along the Po River, lies the humble town of Cremona. In the 16th century, this place wasn't a capital or a military giant, but it held something else, entirely exquisite craftsmanship. This was where guilds of builders, artisans, and instrument makers turned wood into magic. And right here, the violin as we know it was truly born. Leading this quiet revolution was Andrea Amati, a master luthier with ideas that shaped an entire instrument family, building on the lira da braccio and other Renaissance fiddles. Amati slimmed down the body, improved the arching of the top and back, and standardized the proportions. His innovations weren't experiments, they were the blueprint. He introduced F-shaped sound holes that boosted sound transmission and stabilized the structure. His instruments were smaller, lighter, and more responsive than anything before. Crucially, he tuned them in perfect fifths, a system that gave the violin its nimble range and distinct tone. By the mid-1500s, Amati violins were royal commissions, including King Charles I of France, who ordered a set of 24 for his court. These were more than music makers. They were status symbols, hand-painted and gilded, blending craft and visual art. Cremona quickly became the hotspot for outstanding violin making. Other families followed Amati's tradition, most famously the Guarneris and Stradivarius. They didn't just copy Amati, they refined, expanded, and deepened his vision. Cremona violins stopped being nameless workshop products. They became signed masterpieces, each with its own voice and soul. So why Cremona? Some say it's the quality of local maple and spruce. Others credit the perfect climate for slow, even wood drying. Some point to the tight-knit guild culture, where skills passed through apprenticeships and secrets were whispered, never written down, whatever the reason. Cremona became to violins what Florence was to painting. From these narrow cobblestone streets came an instrument that could whisper, weep, dance, or moan, one that would shape centuries of European music and beyond. By the early 17th century, the violin had outgrown its birthplace, no longer confined to Cremona's luthier shops. It spread from palace to palace, chapel to chapel, crossing Renaissance Europe's borders. With every journey, it gained power, prestige, and purpose. Italy remained the violin's cultural heartland. Composers like Claudio Monteverdi were among the first to bring the violin into formal compositions. In Monteverdi's Orfeo, widely hailed as the first great opera, the violin wasn't just background noise. It conveyed mood, emotion, and sacred grandeur. The instrument had evolved from a player's rustic tool to a dramatic voice capable of seduction, sorrow, and triumph. Soon enough, Italian violinists and makers took their craft abroad. They moved to Germany, Austria, and France, where royal courts eagerly embraced the latest musical trends. The violin became a staple in chamber orchestras, prized for its clear, brilliant sound in Paris, passed down by word of mouth. For whatever reason, Cremona became the violin talent factory, kind of like Florence was for painting. From these narrow cobblestone streets came an instrument that could whisper, cry, dance, or complain. An instrument that would shape centuries of music across Europe and beyond. By the early 1600s, the violin had outgrown its birthplace, no longer confined to Cremona's luthier shops. It started spreading from palace to palace, chapel to chapel, crossing Renaissance Europe's borders, and after every trip, it gained strength, prestige, and purpose. Italy was still the violin capital. Of course, composers like Claudio Monteverdi were among the first to officially include the violin in their works. In Monteverdi's Orfeo, widely considered the first great opera, the violin wasn't just background music, it conveyed mood, emotion, and a kind of sacred grandeur. This wasn't some crude fiddle anymore. It was a dramatic voice, capable of seduction, sorrow, and triumph. Soon enough, Italian violinists and makers took their craft. Abroad, they moved to Germany, Austria, and France, where royal courts eagerly snapped up the latest music trends. The violin became a staple in chamber orchestras, prized for its clear, brilliant sound. In Paris, King Louis XIV's court embraced it enthusiastically. The Sun King even had an official 24-piece violin orchestra, Le 24 Violons, a strong statement about the instrument's rising status. Meanwhile, Germany and Austria started developing their own violin schools and makers. Makers like Jacob Stainer crafted instruments with wider, deeper bodies, favoring a warm sound over the sharpness of Italian designs. The instruments, Heinrich Biber pushed the instrument's limits, composing solo pieces packed with artistic flair and emotional depth. Churches also gave the violin a thumbs up. It backed choirs, filled stone cathedrals with soaring melodies, and joined sacred oratorios, no longer seen as too sexy or worldly. It earned its spot in the highest realm of spiritual music. By the late 17th century, the violin was no mere curiosity. It was essential for composers, performers, and audiences alike. It fit smoky taverns, royal balls, and candlelit churches perfectly. And that's just the beginning. Next up, the golden age of violin making, starring a name synonymous with perfection, Antonio Stradivari. If Andrea Amati birthed the violin, Stradivari perfected it. Born in Cremona in 1644, Stradivari trained under the Amati workshop tradition, but quickly ditched imitation. What he created at the turn of the 18th century became the gold standard, not just for violins, but for the art of music itself. Stradivari's instruments were not just beautiful, they were masterpieces of wood selection, a symmetry, elegant shaping, and a glossy varnish that remains a mystery, adding visual and sonic depth. Stradivari violins sing with a clear, powerful, haunting warmth. They can fill the back of a concert hall, yet whisper intimately to a single listener. Stradivari crafted over 1,000 instruments in his lifetime: violins, violas, cellos, even guitars. About 650 survive today, each named after royalty like the Savior, the The Land, and Lady Blunt. Many pieces are still played by the world's greatest soloists, even centuries later. Their sound is unmatched. Some scientists have tried to crack Stradivari's code by scanning wood, analyzing varnish, or modeling acoustics, but truth is, no one's nailed it yet. So what made his work so special? Part of it was the wood slow-grown high-altitude spruce tops and flame maple backs aged to near perfection, but mostly, it was his meticulous tweaks, small changes to thickness, curvature, and shape gave each instrument a unique voice. Throughout his life, Stradivari's fame spread beyond Cremona. Kings, dukes, and master musicians hunted his instruments. His workshop became legendary even after his death in 1737. Musicians saw Stradivari violins as the ultimate prize. Instruments so responsive they seemed alive. Stradivari wasn't the only top craftsman of his day. The Guarneri family, especially Giuseppe Guarneri del Gesù, made violins with darker, stronger tones favored by soloists like Paganini, but the name Stradivari remains legendary. His instruments are like relics from a golden age that produced divine sounds. The golden era of violin making reached its peak. From here on, the violin would leave the workshop and hit the stage, entering the era of virtuosos who'd stretch it and the human spirit to the limit. By the 18th century, the violin had fully evolved from backup singer to lead act, were powerful, warm, and haunting. They could fill the back of a concert hall, yet still whisper intimately to a single listener. Stradivari made over 1,000 instruments in his lifetime: violins, violas, cellos, and even guitars. About 650 survive today, each named after royalty like the Messiah, the Landgrave, and Lady Blunt. Many are still played by the world's greatest soloists. Centuries later, their sound remains unmatched. Some scientists have tried to crack the Stradivari secret by scanning wood, analyzing varnish, or modeling acoustics, but the truth is, no one can fully copy what he did. What makes his work so special, partly the wood, slow-growing high-altitude spruce on top and flamed maple on the back were aged almost perfectly, but mostly it's the meticulous tweaks, the tiny changes in thickness, arching, and shape that gave each Stradivari instrument its unique voice. In his lifetime, Stradivari's fame spread beyond Cremona. Kings, dukes, and master musicians all sought his instruments. His workshop became legendary even after his death in 1737. Musicians saw Stradivarius as the ultimate prize, an instrument so responsive it felt alive. Stradivari wasn't the only great craftsman back then. The Guarneri family, especially Giuseppe Guarneri del Gesù, made violins with a darker, more powerful sound favored by soloists like Paganini, but the name Stradivari remains a legend. His instruments are relics from an era that created heavenly sound. The golden age of violin making hit its peak, and from this point on, the violin would move from the maker's hands to the stage, into the era of virtuosos who pushed it, and the human spirit, too, from the maker's hands to the stage, into the era of master performers who stretched it, and the human spirit, too, the limit. By the 18th century, The violin had fully evolved from a backup voice to the lead role. It wasn't just filling harmony or leading dance rhythms anymore. It began to speak as if gifted with its own personality. And in the hands of a new generation of masters, the violin became an astonishing instrument. One of the first stars was Arcangelo Corelli, whose elegant and emotional sonatas helped shape the violin's role in Baroque music. He wasn't flashy on stage, but his playing was admired for its grace and control. His works laid the groundwork for generations of violinists, focusing on expression, tone, and structure. Then came Antonio Vivaldi, Venice's very own red-robed priest, a fiery composer and performer. Vivaldi penned over 230 violin concertos, the most famous being the Four Seasons. These pieces weren't just music, they were full-on theatrical experiences packed with sound, chirping birds, thunder crashes, and rustic dance moves. Vivaldi proved the violin could not only sing, but tell stories. When musical tastes shifted to the classical era, the violin stayed front and center. Composers like Mozart and Beethoven crafted sonatas and concertos that demanded finesse, speed, and deep emotional smarts. Violinists stopped being mere technicians. They became storytellers and dancers, moving with the orchestra and breathing life into every note. But it wasn't until the early 19th century that the idea of the violinist as a legendary rock star hit its peak. Thanks to Niccolò Paganini, with his skinny frame, almost supernatural stage presence, and near impossible technique, Paganini wasn't just a musician, he was a phenomenon. Rumor had it he'd sold his soul to the devil. His fingers flew over the strings with dizzying double stops, harmonics, and left-hand pizzicato tricks. His 24 caprices for solo violin remain the Everest that modern players still sweat over. Paganini changed everything after him. Violin playing was never the same. He elevated the instrument's status and kicked off an era where soloists were treated like royalty. Every bow stroke turned the violin into a voice, not just any voice, but sometimes divine, sometimes devilish, but always unforgettable. As the violin grew in popularity and prestige through the 18th and 19th centuries, it became the backbone of the orchestra. Once the sidekick to singers and trophy hunters, the violin now led the charge with its sweet, expressive, and versatile tones. It became the go-to instrument for composers to express their grandest ideas. The transformation started with the Baroque orchestra, where string instruments formed the foundation. First and second violins appeared to create harmony and melody. Composers like Bach and Handel gave the violin starring roles in their concertos and orchestral suites, but it was still part of a collective identity. Back then, there were no huge orchestras, just close-knit, intimate groups. Then came the classical era, and everything blew up. Composers like Haydn and Mozart shaped the modern symphony, with the violin as the centerpiece. Haydn, often called the father of the symphony, built rich, balanced orchestral textures with the violin driving the melodies. Mozart took it further, giving the violin elegant, soaring lines handled with gentle agility. In his symphonies, the violin could be joyful, tragic, or sacred all within a few bars. But Beethoven was the real game changer. He expanded the scale, deepened emotional range, and set unprecedented demands on every section, especially the strings. First violins usually carried the main themes, while second violins played crucial roles in harmony and rhythm, no longer sidekicks. They became the storytellers of the symphonic drama. By the Romantic era, orchestras had grown huge, and the violin was king. Brahms, Tchaikovsky, Dvořák, and many others brought joyous melodies and heroic passages to both symphonies and concertos. Violinists had to master nuance, stamina, and orchestra coordination, keeping up with rapidly increasing musical complexity. Conductors also began relying on the concertmaster, the lead violinist, not just to lead the section, but to bridge the gap between conductor and orchestra. In many ways, the concertmaster became the second in command, responsible for tuning, bowing, and setting the tone for the entire. By the Romantic era, orchestras were thriving, and the violin was king. Brahms, Tchaikovsky, Dvořák, and a bunch of other composers gifted the violin with lively tunes and heroic passages in both symphonies and concertos. Violinists and orchestras had to master nuance, stamina, and teamwork, while keeping up with the rapidly increasing complexity of the music. Conductors also started to lean on the concertmaster, the lead violinist, not just to guide the strings, but to bridge the gap between conductor and orchestra in many ways. The concertmaster became the second in command, responsible for tuning, bowing, and setting the tone for the entire orchestra, from chamber groups to 100-piece symphonies. The violin became woven into the very DNA of Western classical music. It stopped being just an instrument and became the voice of the symphony itself. By the 20th century, the violin had long conquered European concert halls, but its journey wasn't over, no longer confined to symphony or opera. The violin began crossing borders and genres, bringing its sound into cultures far and wide. It wasn't just classical anymore. This fresh twist has now become a staple in pop, rock, and experimental music. Artists like Lindsey Stirling blend into cultures way beyond its Italian roots. In Eastern Europe, the violin played a vivid, emotional role in Romani or Degen music, long before Tchaikovsky or Brahms made it fancy. In Romani hands, the violin danced, shouted, and dazzled with dazzling, heart-wrenching melodies. It became a voice of rebellion and praise, passed down orally, not through conservatory lessons. Across the Atlantic, the violin transformed again. In American folk, Appalachian, and bluegrass music, it shrugged off its noble cloak and laced up old boots. It became the community's instrument, leading barn dances, telling stories through reels and jigs. Its style changed too, fast, rhythmic bowing, open tunings, and spontaneous improvisation took center stage. In India, the violin found an entirely new identity, adapted into Carnatic and Hindustani classical music. Players sit on the floor, the violin tilted toward their ankle like a rolling scroll. Indian violinists master micro, slides, and ornamentations far from Western tradition, yet perfectly suited for raga and tala. The violin crossed cultural boundaries and became something uniquely Indian. Meanwhile, in Latin America, the violin thrived in mariachi bands and folk groups. In Argentina, it tangoed with the bandoneon in smoky, fiery rooms. In Mexico, songs soared on high-pitched violin melodies over trumpets and guitars. Wherever it landed, the violin adapted not by dominating, but by listening and blending in. Jazz pushed the violin even further. In the 1930s and 40s, artists like Stefan Grappelli turned it into a lively, joyful lead voice in France's bustling clubs. Later, Jean-Luc Ponty and Regina Carter redefined the violin for fusion and modern jazz, proving it could groove, bend, and improvise like the best of them. By the 21st century, the violin had become a global citizen. It speaks any musical language: classical, jazz, folk, experimental. Its voice can be crystal clear or rough as nails, precise or wildly free, and through every transformation, it's still very much itself. Today, the violin stands at a fascinating crossroads, a timeless instrument in a fast-changing world. It still holds its ground in orchestras, concert halls, and conservatories, but it's also thriving in genres and places its old-school masters never dreamed of. Its voice, haunting, human, endlessly adaptable, continues to echo across continents and cultures. In classical music, the violin remains essential. Young prodigies shine on the global stage, playing concertos written centuries ago with fresh emotion and killer technique. International competitions like Queen Elizabeth and Menuhin kickstart careers and keep classical tradition alive and fiercely competitive. But change is afoot. More players are challenging tradition, pushing the violin's boundaries. Contemporary composers write for it in new ways, using extended techniques, electronics, loops, and non-Western tunings. The violin no longer just sings. It scratches, whispers, yells, and taps. It can mimic machines, birds, or pure chaos. In the hands of pioneers like Hilary Hahn, Patricia Kopachinskaja, and Curtis Stewart, the violin becomes a sound lab. Meanwhile, technology is reshaping how we interact with the instrument. Electric violins, once a novelty, are now common in pop, rock, and experimental music. Artists like Lindsey Stirling mix dance, EDM, and cinematic themes into viral violin performances that reach millions online. It's a reminder that the violin's appeal isn't just about sound. It's visual, emotional, and personal. Education is evolving too, with YouTube tutorials, online classes, and digital sheet music. The violin is more accessible than ever. Student in Nairobi or Limerick can now learn from a Juilliard professor with just a tap on their screen. But alongside, a student in Nairobi or Limerick can jam with a Juilliard professor just by tapping a screen. But alongside this democratization comes a big question. How do you keep depth and discipline in a world obsessed with speed still, amid all the noise? The violin's voice keeps echoing. Why? Because it is, and always has been, an extension of the human voice. It cries like we do. It sings how we wish we could. And whether it's played on a rickety stage, a subway platform, or in front of 10 million subscribers, the violin can stop time, if only for a moment. Elegant, but demanding. Ancient, yet evolving. The violin isn't just an instrument, it's a storyteller, and its story is still being written.